July 20th, 2020. It's early Monday morning in Zion, Illinois, a quiet community of 25,000 an hour north of Chicago.
Zion is a little bit more rural. You can definitely see that suburban, quiet, picket fence kind of life.
There's a vibe of family when you come into town. It's close-knit.
You get that everybody knows everybody kind of feel.
But even in the quietest community, tragedy can strike.
Shortly before sunrise, a neighbor heard some loud screaming.
Waking up around 5 in the morning to screams definitely startled a lot of people.
Mama, wake up!
What's going on?
There are people screaming outside.
Okay, well, go on back to bed. I'll take care of it.
They look out the window and they see 3 people. One's laying on the ground and 2 people standing over him.
The neighbor quickly calls 911.
I was covering a midnight shift, and our dispatch sent for a report of a subject laying in the middle of the street.
When first responders arrive, they find 21-year-old Jacqueline Mora and her brother Carlos standing over another man who sprawled on the ground.
He was unresponsive, but he was bleeding from his chest.
Help him, please.
She's screaming, trying to figure out what's going on.
She's also obviously pregnant.
They're asking her what happened. She says she doesn't know.
However, she did identify the injured man as Gregory Gilmore.
He's my baby's father.
Gregory Gilmore wasn't exactly a stranger to local police.
When I started working in Zion in 2013, Gregory was a juvenile and getting into juvenile mischief and things like that.
His parents split up when he was younger, and Gregory spent his teenage years acting out.
But he'd eventually found a better outlet.
Gregory had a passion for music, and he wanted to use that gift to share with others.
Music gave him focus and a new sense of direction.
At this point, I had not really dealt with Gregory in a few years. So it was my understanding that he was turning things around, kind of moving on, kind of growing up and moving on with his life, kind of learning how to become an adult.
However, music wasn't his only passion. There was also Jacqueline.
Gregory was a good-looking guy and active in the local music scene. So there were always lots of women interested in him.
But that didn't matter because once he met Jacqueline, he knew that was his person.
Most people their age might be thinking about just dating and playing the field and not really being settled down. Yet the two of them found each other and chose each other.
Gregory brought the same passionate intensity he had for music to his relationship with Jacqueline.
Everybody knew that they were madly in love. You could see it. And he would do anything to make sure that their love lasted.
And it wouldn't be long before something put that commitment to the test.
As Jacqueline and Gregory's love story unfolds, that love grows into a child. They're pregnant.
Getting pregnant at such a young age, there's so many things to really consider.
But where some might see an obstacle, Gregory and Jacqueline saw opportunity.
Of course, they're nervous about the responsibilities ahead, but they couldn't be more excited.
They were both really looking forward to parenthood. They felt that their love could carry them through any challenge.
And by the summer of 2020, the young couple was looking forward to their baby's arrival.
Jacqueline was 7 months pregnant. Gregory was pretty excited about having his first child. That was a big thing. He was trying to plan his future to be a good dad and get things in order.
He had so much going for him.
What you got to say?
But now, after Jacqueline's screams alerted neighbors, police have arrived to find him lying on the street, covered in blood.
He had some type of large wound to his chest.
It was unclear if he'd been shot or stabbed.
But as the EMT gets to work, there's no doubt it's life-threatening.
with the location of it and the amount of blood that he appeared to be losing. It's critical at that point to get him from the street into that ambulance.
Then, as EMTs rush Gregory to the hospital, detectives arrive and try to piece together what happened.
It's really important when they get on the scene of this type of crime to speak to the witnesses.
Either of you see what happened?
No.
Jacqueline told police she found him outside like this.
But Jacqueline does know someone who might have reason to hurt Gregory.
She said Gregory had beef with someone.
This person had possibly shot up a residence in the same area recently.
You think he may have done this?
Maybe. I'm not sure.
She doesn't know any details about him.
However, she does know one thing.
He goes by the name of Foe.
"23-year-old Gregory Gilmore had a lot to look forward to in life.
He was starting to make a name for himself with his music.
And he was expecting a child with his girlfriend, 21-year-old Jacqueline Mora.
It just seemed like Gregory kind of had everything going for him at this point.
But now, Gregory's future is hanging in the balance.
Around 4:50 a.m. on July 20th, police got a 911 call reporting that a distraught woman was screaming for help.
When officers got there, they found a male laying in the street.
He was unresponsive and bleeding from a serious wound to his chest.
And they find a hysterical Jacqueline Mora standing over the love of her life.
While the police pulled Jacqueline and her brother Carlos aside, EMTs raced to save Gregory's life.
With the amount of blood loss at the scene, first responders know they needed to get Gregory to the hospital quickly.
As EMTs rushed Gregory to the hospital, detectives turned to Jacqueline to try and sort out what happened.
It was a typical night for Jacqueline and her boyfriend Gregory and her brother Carlos all hanging out together at Jacqueline's place.
What time was this?
Carlos went to bed around 4.
Around 4.
Her brother was living with her at the time.
According to Jacqueline, Gregory left not long after.
Was he walking, driving?
Driving.
She pointed to a vehicle that was outside and said that he was driving home.
But she says it wasn't long after Gregory walked out the door that she realized something was wrong.
She didn't hear Gregory's car starting.
She went and looked out of the window and saw Greg's car was still there.
Came out to check on him?
Yeah.
She thought maybe he was having engine trouble.
But the problem was much worse.
Greg! Oh my God!
She found him in the street.
Jacqueline went into shock.
He wasn't moving and there was blood everywhere.
She says she tried to drag him out of the street.
But then she noticed something.
There was a knife near Gregory.
I saw the knife and I picked it up and there was blood on it.
Where's the knife now?
I don't know. When I saw the blood, I dropped it.
Then she'd gone for help.
She goes inside and screams for her brother to wake up, and once they're both outside, Jacqueline loses it.
That's when the neighbor called 911.
You think someone was waiting outside and stabbed him?
Yeah.
And Jacqueline thinks she knows who it was, too.
Did you know anyone that may want to hurt him?
This guy Foe, they've been having arguments and fighting a lot.
She didn't know much else about him, only that he had some sort of beef with Gregory.
Jacqueline's brother Carlos seconds his sister's suspicion that Foe is likely responsible.
Do you know what the beef was about?
No, it's been going on for a while, though.
He also mentioned that Foe had supposedly shot up a house in the neighborhood a few days earlier.
He must have thought it was our house.
He thought Gregory had been the target.
But like his sister, he didn't see what happened to Gregory.
He said that he had already gone to bed and was asleep when his sister came back to the house screaming.
The crime scene doesn't tell detectives much about the attack either.
There's a pool of blood, along with what looks like Gregory's keys.
Detectives also located the knife that Jacqueline mentions.
There was a knife in some tall grass that was kind of adjacent to the curb.
While crime scene technicians bag the knife and keys as evidence, the detectives go door to door in the surrounding area looking for potential witnesses.
As part of the initial investigation, we'll do what's called a neighborhood canvass.
And they want to talk to neighbors, anybody who may have heard anything, who may have been driving by.
The detectives don't get far before they spot what could be the key to uncovering what happened.
The neighbor had surveillance cameras mounted on their house.
Maybe it corroborates Jacqueline's story. Maybe we capture the killer.
Hoping that's the case, the detectives knock on the neighbor's door.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Sorry to bother you. We see you have a surveillance camera over there.
When we're trying to get cooperation from neighbors, sometimes it can be difficult because they have to live in this community and they don't want any backlash.
Yeah.
Anyway, we can take a look at the footage.
However, Jacqueline's neighbor is willing to share the video with detectives.
I wouldn't know how to access it. I have to ask my kid.
Okay, well, could you give us a call as soon as you can access it?
Yes, of course.
He's an older gentleman, and his son's the one who set up the system.
Detectives leave the neighbor a card and ask him to get in touch as soon as he gets a hold of his son. Then they move on to the next house.
Police come across a woman who says that she is the one who actually made that 911 call.
Could you tell us what you saw?
Actually, I was asleep, and my son, he woke me up saying that he heard somebody screaming outside.
She says she didn't witness the stabbing.
She got up and looked outside and saw Gregory lying down. She saw Carlos and she saw Jacqueline screaming for help.
He wasn't moving.
Still, the detectives do ask the woman to bring her son down to the station later for a formal statement.
The kid is only 11, but detectives wanted to know if he saw anything before he woke up his mother.
If he did, it might be the key to solving the case, because he might be the detectives' only eyewitness.
Once they wrap up their canvass, detectives got an update on Gregory.
Mrs. Richards.
I was notified by the hospital that he had not made it.
This case is now a homicide.
He didn't make it.
Detectives investigating the early morning stabbing that sent 23-year-old Gregory Gilmore to the hospital have just learned that they're now investigating a homicide.
They learned that Gregory sadly lost his life due to those injuries.
Detectives have identified one possible suspect, though. A man who, according to Gregory's girlfriend Jacqueline, goes by the name of Foe.
Gregory had some sort of dispute going on with this person.
Although at this point, detectives are unsure if Foe is his real name or if it's a street name.
The detectives hope that Jacqueline and her brother Carlos, who've been escorted to the precinct, can shed more light on the matter.
We knew these were the two people that were on scene and that were last with Gregory. So they needed a formal question.
When the detectives sit down with Jacqueline, she walks them back through the moments leading up to the murder.
She said they had been hanging out at her house. Gregory left, and when she didn't hear his car start, she went outside and found him bleeding in the street.
Greg?
This Foe guy. Anything else you can tell us about him?
Not really. I never met the man.
But she knew he had beef with Greg.
That's what Greg said.
Getting nowhere, the detectives turn their questions to Jacqueline and Gregory's relationship.
As a matter of procedure, they needed to rule out Jacqueline and her brother as possible suspects.
But what are supposed to be routine questions take an unexpected turn.
She's starting to say that the relationship was a little bit tumultuous.
What do you mean exactly?
He has a hard time controlling himself when he got mad.
Jacqueline confides that their relationship was sometimes abusive.
You ever call the police?
No.
She didn't feel like pressing charges because she loved Gregory. And not only that, he was the father of her child.
And she never considered ending the relationship.
She said she didn't want to lose what she had with him, the good times they had together. She'd hoped that eventually they could work through their problems.
But now, the detectives wonder if those hopes had taken a tragic turn.
This could be a case of self-defense.
He put hands on you last night?
No.
She stuck to her initial story that she found Gregory, laying in the roadway.
When the detectives move on to Carlos, he again backs up his sister's story.
Carlos's version of what happened pretty much mirrored what Jacqueline told police.
But you didn't see what happened?
No, I already gone to bed.
Carlos tells police she came and got him. She was hysterical. Something happened to Gregory. He goes outside and Gregory's on the ground, lying there, a pool of blood.
Carlos also confirms much of what his sister said about Gregory's alleged abuse.
He believed that Jacqueline and Gregory sometimes had a rough relationship.
You ever see him get violent?
Nah, he wouldn't try anything around me.
He said that he spoke to Gregory saying, "Don't harm my sister."
And he listened?
Yeah, we were cool.
Carlos got along with Gregory, but as a protective brother, he knew that anything that happened in their relationship, he was going to stand by his sister.
And this guy, Foe, he was beefing with. Anything more you can tell us about that?
Nah, all I know is what I heard.
Okay.
After taking Jacqueline and Carlos's statements, the detectives do a record search, hoping to identify the mysterious foe.
They're looking for any incidents involving Gregory that might give them a lead on his identity.
They come up empty-handed.
There was no indication that Gregory had any ongoing disputes with anyone or that he had been the target of any violent crimes recently at all.
There's also no trace of anyone who goes by Foe, even as a street name.
Although, if it is a street name, it might not show up in police records.
The records search a bust. The detectives contact Gregory's family, hoping they might know something about the alleged killer.
When police contact Gregory's family,
Hello?
they are in utter disbelief. They can't believe that something's happened to him. He was a great spirit throughout the community. He got along with everyone.
Are you sure about that? We heard he was having trouble with a guy named Foe.
Who?
The detectives asked if they knew about this faux character that maybe had it out for Gregory, but the family has no idea who this person is.
There's no one that they could think of who would want to harm him. He didn't have trouble with the law. He didn't have run-ins with the bad crowd or anything.
According to the family, there was only one source of trouble in Gregory's life: Jacqueline.
They've witnessed arguments. They've witnessed physical contact.
However, there's one big difference.
The family tells officers that Jacqueline was the aggressive one.
She had been physically violent with him.
How aggressive?
Are we talking violent?
Yeah, sometimes.
They say if anyone had the ability to do this to Gregory, it's Jacqueline.
Gregory Gilmore's father has told the detectives investigating his murder that the 23-year-old had a troubled relationship with Jacqueline Mora, the mother of his unborn child.
However, contrary to what Jacqueline told the police, Gregory's father claims that she was the abusive one.
You actually witnessed this abuse from Jacqueline?
Yes. Talking physical abuse?
Yes. They said that this is something that they have witnessed themselves. They've witnessed arguments, they've witnessed physical contact.
We learned that Jacqueline and Gregory had had some incidents in the past, some incidents of domestic violence. As recently as a month or so before this tragedy occurred,
I seen her hit him and push him around.
There is a prevailing narrative that men can't be abused. A lot of times we have a situation to where if a man says, I'm being abused, someone is hitting me, we're treated differently. But honestly, even in the justice system, a lot of times it seems like there's more of a burden that men have to prove to show that they're being abused.
Our society assumes that men can always take care of themselves, and therefore that means that they're not hurt or victimized, although that's absolutely not true.
Domestic abuse is mostly talked about when the victim is a woman, but men are also victims, they're also survivors. They also need help. They need assistance.
One altercation Gregory's father witnessed was even disturbingly similar to the way his son was killed.
Gregory's family told us of an incident where she had stabbed him in the past that was never reported to police.
I stepped in and broke up the fight.
When was that?
About a year ago.
Greg's dad said he doesn't know what she would have done if he hadn't stepped in to break up the fight.
He had to go to the hospital to get treated, but he did not want to report that, and it was never documented anywhere.
After that, Gregory's parents had urged him to break things off with her, but he insisted that they could work things out.
I just wish you would have listened to me.
I'm sure you did everything you could.
Often in situations like this, family members will sometimes have guilt or shame or worry about, was there anything that I could do? Could I have helped? Could I have jumped in? Is there anything I could have said or done that could have changed the scenario?
Based on what they hear from Greg's dad, the detectives believe they now know how he died.
Jacqueline got angry again and took it a step further.
They're already hearing of all the reports of the arguments and lots of toxicity.
It would also explain why they can't find any trace of the mysterious foe who Jacqueline had offered up as Gregory's likely killer.
It seemed that that was just a story she made up to try and explain what may have happened to him.
The detectives hope there may be a way to prove that, too.
After detectives are done interviewing Gregory's family, they go to that initial 911 call. They contact the 11-year-old boy and his mother to try and see if he remembers any other details.
Witnesses, their memories may get worse as time goes on. So it's really important for officers to catch up with these individuals as soon as possible.
The fact that their witness is only 11 adds to the challenge.
When speaking with minors that witness a violent incident like this, you have to be very sensitive.
It's important that they don't ask questions in a way that can harm the child long term.
In the interview, the boy tells detectives he'd been in bed when he was woken up by the sound of shouting outside.
He described how he looked out the window and he saw a male and a female.
Do you know the people that were arguing next door?
Yeah, they're always arguing over there.
But this time was different.
It escalated to punches being thrown.
Or was it more than punches?
He saw the male fall.
And he said Gregory didn't get back up.
One of Jacqueline Mora's neighbors has told the detectives investigating her boyfriend's murder what happened in the moments leading up to the 911 call.
Why are you doing this? It's the same thing over and over again, every single day. It's the same.
The boy heard a commotion outside. He looked out the window and he saw them fighting, and then Gregory falls on the ground.
He was able to point out Jacqueline as the female that was involved and Gregory as the male.
But there's something the little boy didn't see.
He doesn't recall seeing a knife. All he knows is that he saw them fighting and he saw Gregory fall.
That makes him concerned, and he wakes up his mother.
When your son woke you up, did he say anything about a weapon?
No, but when he came running into the room, I could tell he was scared.
She looked out and she knew something was wrong.
She saw Jacqueline, Carlos, and Gregory, but Gregory was laying down.
Could you see any blood?
No. But Jackie, she was screaming and Greg wasn't moving.
That's when she called 911.
I just still can't believe she killed him.
However, before they make an arrest, the detectives would still like to find evidence that puts the knife in Jacqueline's hand.
They know that prosecutors would like to build the case on more than just the 11-year-old's testimony.
So detectives hoped that the surveillance from the neighbor across the street could fill in the gaps from the child's story.
And luckily, when detectives reach out, the neighbor's son has been able to download the video.
The quality wasn't the best. It was very grainy, but you could see Jacqueline and Gregory getting into a physical altercation in the middle of the street. Then they kind of go off camera.
Then, a moment later, Greg staggers back into the camera's field of view.
He stumbles, and then they see him fall to the ground.
And he never gets up again.
The detectives suspect the actual stabbing occurred in those brief moments when Jacqueline and Gregory were off camera.
The camera doesn't lie. It shows exactly what happened. You can't put a spin on it.
But that can't stop someone from trying.
The police call Jacqueline back into the station and they tell her, hey, is anything you've left out?
I don't think so.
She stuck to her initial story. Gregory had come to her house, they were hanging out, and that eventually Gregory was gonna leave and she went back to doing what she was doing.
You're sure about that?
She was presented with that fact that there might be surveillance footage of what happened.
At that moment, she knew it was over.
Okay, we had a fight.
She started to just come clean about everything.
She said that they were inside hanging out and that her and Greg started to get into an argument.
But she claimed that it was Gregory who was angry and out of control.
So, where were you last night?
Nowhere?
Don't lie to me.
This is crazy. You always accusing me of something.
So I grabbed the knife.
She said she grabbed a knife because Gregory had been violent with her in the past.
She just wanted to protect herself.
She told Greg he needed to leave, and he walked outside.
But she also said that when Greg left, her dog had followed him out.
According to Jacqueline, that's when things escalated.
She heard one of her dogs yelp. She went outside and saw Gregory hitting one of her dogs. She told Gregory to stop.
And that's when the argument started all over again.
Don't you be hitting my dog!
Oh, you want me to hit something else?
She said that Greg made some threatening statements towards her and started walking at her.
It was a fatal mistake.
She says in that moment, she just acted with rage and emotions, and she admits that she stabbed Gregory in the chest.
And he tried to hit me. I'm so tired of it.
She didn't come out and completely say that she stabbed him in, quote, self-defense. but that was what she was alluding to.
She also says that she panicked once she saw Gregory on the ground with blood gushing from his chest.
She realized, oh my God, what did I do?
Then she went back inside and she told her brother what happened. He told her she needed to call the police.
Even though she didn't want to, he said that this was something that she had to do.
But Jacqueline says that when the time to tell the truth came, she couldn't.
She said she just couldn't follow his advice.
She makes up a story. She makes up a person that Gregory had some type of shady dealings with, and that person, foe, was the one who actually did this to Gregory. All not true, all made up.
When someone does something and didn't really think it through, they have to figure out what kind of lies can I now come up with. And unfortunately, that snowballs, where often you can't keep up with all the lies.
Now the detectives need to figure out if she's still lying.
Part of Jacqueline's statement was that she felt threatened by Gregory. That's something that can be argued by a defendant. So it's critical to look into that and figure out, was there a history of abuse or not?
According to Jacqueline, the answer is yes.
Here, let me show you.
She says that she's got, evidence of marks on herself and things like that.
And she has it all saved on her phone.
Jacqueline Mora has confessed to stabbing her boyfriend, Gregory Gilmore, but claims she did it to protect herself.
Jacqueline told police that they've had domestic abuse in their relationship. She was a battered woman and she feared for her life.
Despite the credibility issues, the fact that Jacqueline was a woman that was 7 months pregnant definitely weighed in her favor.
She also claims to have proof that Gregory was abusive on her cell phone.
Phones can be a treasure trove of information for investigators.
Can we hold on to this so we can go through it?
Yeah, of course.
After talking to Jacqueline a second time, the detectives dig deeper into her story.
We obtained phone records, social media records, and downloaded cell phones, both belonging to Jacqueline and Gregory, to try to either confirm or deny her claims of this past abuse. Because if there wasn't, then that kind of negates that claim that she would have felt threatened by Gregory or she would have needed this knife to physically defend herself.
The records do back up at least some of Jacqueline's claims.
What it showed to me was a long, very volatile relationship between the two. There was very angry messages, accusatory messages, threatening messages, back and forth.
But there is also something conspicuously absent.
Despite what you told detectives, they can't find any photos of her with injuries.
I'd never found any evidence specifically that showed Gregory abusing her, but there was definitely videos and messages that showed Jacqueline being very antagonistic and threatening.
And once Jacqueline was pregnant, their already toxic relationship only got worse.
Adding a baby now to the mix, financially as well as emotionally, there's more responsibilities, and it can cause things to start to go awry.
It was a very volatile situation between the two of them, kind of a ticking time bomb.
And early on the morning of July 20th, it exploded.
At around 1:30 that morning, Gregory texted Jacqueline asking if he could come over.
They hung out and played video games with her brother.
But at some point, an argument ensued.
So where were you last night?
Nowhere.
Don't lie to me.
She kind of displayed a lack of emotional control.
And perhaps Gregory had finally had enough.
This is crazy. You're always accusing me of something.
There was indicators that this was going to continue to get worse and continue to escalate and continue to escalate.
You're always lying.
That's what the detectives believe happened in this case.
Based on their surveillance video, Gregory left, and Jacqueline followed him outside, clutching a knife.
Greg, don't you walk away from me. Stop.
Let go of me, man.
Don't you? Why are you doing this to me?
It's the same thing every single day and over and over again. Man, stop touching me all the time, every single time. You're just crazy and paranoid.
I think I'm crazy.
Yo, Jacqueline, what are you doing, Jacqueline?
I do believe this probably was a crime of, quote, passion, or she just reacted and stabbed him.
Then after lashing out, she immediately regretted what she'd done.
Greg, baby.
Oh, God. Jacqueline definitely showed some remorse. She did appear upset by what happened.
But that didn't stop her from trying to hide what she'd done.
She woke her brother Carlos up and asked him for his help.
Call the cops. We gotta call the cops.
No!
That's a tough spot to be in. Your sister has come to you in a panic. You've told her the right thing, and you're kind of standing back to see if she'll do it. And then she doesn't.
I do feel for Carlos' situation, and anybody put in a position to where you're encouraging your family member to do the right thing, but ultimately, when they don't, you now have to make that decision. Are you gonna go along with what your family member is doing, or are you gonna tell the truth?
But will the detectives and the district attorney see it that way?
What he did by kind of going along with Jacqueline's story initially at the scene could be considered obstructive, but in this case, especially with her statement that he had told her to tell the truth, we just felt like it really wasn't in the best interest of justice to charge Carlos with a crime.
There's no such leniency towards Jacqueline.
Jacqueline was charged with first-degree murder.
But the case never goes to trial.
She took a plea deal to bring it down to second-degree murder.
The key difference between that and first degree is a lack of premeditation.
While she had followed Greg outside with a knife, they couldn't prove that she intended to stab him.
And if the case had gone to trial, there was always the possibility of acquittal.
People are used to women being the victims, right? So in a lot of people's minds, it's hard for them to be able to flip that and decide like, no, this 7-month pregnant woman was the actual abuser, the actual aggressor.
In exchange for her plea, the judge sentences Jacqueline to 15 years in prison.
First-degree murder, she would be looking at much stiffer penalties, maybe a 25 to life.
It's never enough. I don't care how many years it is, it's never enough because it's never gonna bring your loved one back. But in the end, she has to pay for what she did. Her actions resulted in the death of her child's father. And that's something she'll never be able to get away from. That's always gonna sit with her. And she'll have to explain that, unfortunately, to her child when that time comes.
And Gregory's entire family will feel the loss.
They'll never get to see Gregory again. They'll never get to spend holidays, birthdays, any type of special occasions with him again. They were robbed of growing old with Gregory.
He was only 23 years old. He had a whole life ahead of him.
He had so much going for him. He loved life. He loved making others happy. He was just getting his footing to make his mark in the world. And he just did not get that chance to do it. And it's been devastating for the community, his family. Gregory is truly going to be missed.
The city of New York has always been a place where millions of lives move side by side, separated only by a few inches of pavement, a traffic light, or a moment of patience. Every night, thousands of people drive through Brooklyn's streets. They pass strangers they will never meet again. They honk their horns, exchange angry looks, argue over parking spaces, and continue on with their lives. Most conflicts disappear as quickly as they begin. But sometimes, a few seconds can change everything. Sometimes, a small disagreement on a dark street becomes the final chapter of someone's life. In the early hours of July 4, 2016, While much of America was preparing to celebrate Independence Day, a father named Delron Small was driving through Brooklyn with the people he loved most. He was not walking into danger. He was not looking for a confrontation. He was simply trying to get home. Inside his vehicle were his partner, Zaquana Albert, his 5-month-old son, and Albert's young daughter. It was supposed to be an ordinary night. A night of family, celebration, and returning home after spending time together. But somewhere along Atlantic Avenue, between the glow of streetlights and the empty roads of a late summer night, a brief encounter between two drivers became a moment that would never be forgotten. Within seconds, Delron Small would be lying on the pavement. Within seconds, his family would watch their world collapse. And within seconds, another question would enter a national conversation already filled with anger, fear, and distrust. Was this a tragic act of self-defense? Or was it a deadly use of force against a man who never had the chance to explain himself? The answer would depend on who was telling the story. For the family of Delron Small, he was a father, a partner, and a man whose life was taken away during a moment that should have meant nothing more than a frustrating traffic dispute. For Wayne Isaacs, the man who pulled the trigger, he was a police officer who believed he was facing a dangerous threat and had only a few seconds to make a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. Between those two versions of events was a single street, a single vehicle, and a few seconds that would become the center of a courtroom battle. The story of Delron Small is not only about the 3 bullets that ended his life. It is about everything that happened before them. The choices made by 2 strangers. The emotions that grew in a matter of moments. The fear that can take over the human mind when someone believes they are in danger. And the devastating consequences when a situation moves faster than anyone can control. Because behind every headline, behind every investigation, and behind every legal argument, there was a real person. There was Delron Small. A man who had spent 37 years building relationships, creating memories, and becoming someone important in the lives of others. A man whose children would have to grow up without him. A man whose family would forever remember the last moments they shared together. On that night, Delron was not a symbol. He was not a debate. He was not a news story. He was a human being sitting behind the wheel of a car, heading home with his family. And yet, by the time the sun rose over New York City on July 4th, his name had become connected to one of the most difficult questions facing America. When a person approaches a police officer, how much fear is enough to justify deadly force? The events surrounding Delron Small's death unfolded quickly, but the aftermath lasted for years. The investigation would examine video footage, witness statements, and conflicting memories of what happened in those final moments. The courtroom would hear 2 very different versions of the same encounter. One side would describe a dangerous confrontation where a police officer believed he was under attack. The other would describe a man who approached a vehicle and was killed almost immediately, before he had any opportunity to explain his actions. The distance between those 2 realities was only a few seconds. But those seconds would divide families, communities, and public opinion. The night began like many summer nights in Brooklyn. The streets carried the familiar rhythm of the city. Cars moved through neighborhoods filled with people enjoying the holiday weekend. Families gathered together. Fireworks were expected. People were celebrating freedom, independence, and the simple joy of being alive. For Delron Small, it was a night that should have ended with him walking through his front door. Perhaps he would have carried his sleeping baby inside. Perhaps he would have shared a quiet moment with his family before the night ended. Perhaps the next morning would have been filled with ordinary conversations and ordinary plans. But those ordinary moments were taken away. Instead, his family would remember the sound of gunfire. They would remember the confusion. They would remember the terrifying realization that something irreversible had happened. And they would remember that the person they loved was gone. The tragedy of Delron Small's death is found in the contrast between the size of the conflict and the size of the consequence. A disagreement between drivers should have ended with words. A moment of frustration should have disappeared into the night. A few angry seconds should not have become a funeral. But human beings are complicated. Fear, anger, pride, and misunderstanding can collide in unpredictable ways. A person behind a steering wheel can feel trapped. A person approaching a car can appear threatening. A person carrying a firearm can make a decision that cannot be undone. And when those emotions meet, the result can be devastating. The death of Delron Small became another chapter in the ongoing national debate about policing, accountability, and the use of deadly force. At the time, America was already struggling with a series of high-profile cases involving police shootings and questions about how officers interact with civilians, especially black men. Communities across the country were demanding answers. Families were asking why loved ones had died during encounters that seemed like they should never have ended in tragedy. The name Delron Small soon joined that painful list. But for those who knew him, he was never just another case. He was a father. He was a partner. He was someone who had a place at the dinner table, someone whose absence would be felt every day. The legal system would later focus on questions of evidence and responsibility. But before the courtroom arguments began, there was a family trying to understand how a normal night had turned into a nightmare. There was a mother watching her child grow up without his father. There was a partner forced to replay the final moments of a man she loved. There were relatives trying to make sense of a loss that came without warning. And there was one question that would remain at the center of everything. What really happened in those final seconds on Atlantic Avenue? The answer would become the subject of investigations, protests, and a highly watched trial. But before the evidence was examined, before lawyers made their arguments, and before a jury reached its decision, there was only one undeniable fact. Delron Small left home that night expecting to return. He never did. And the story of what happened next would become a painful reminder that sometimes the most life-changing moments do not arrive with a warning. Sometimes they happen in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Brooklyn has always been a place built on movement. It is a borough where millions of stories exist at the same time. Behind every apartment window, behind every passing car, behind every person walking down a sidewalk, there is a different life unfolding. Some people are rushing to work. Some are returning home after a long day. Some are celebrating with friends and family. Some are simply trying to make it through another ordinary night. In the summer of 2016, Brooklyn was a place filled with energy and contradiction. It was one of the most famous parts of New York City, a place where old neighborhoods existed beside rapidly changing communities. Modern buildings stood near decades-old homes. Expensive restaurants and growing businesses shared streets with families who had lived there for generations. The city was always changing. But some things remained the same. The streets could be unpredictable. People could be impatient. And sometimes, a simple interaction between strangers could become something far more serious than anyone imagined. The night of July 3rd, moving into the early morning hours of July 4th, was unlike most nights. Across America, people were celebrating Independence Day weekend. There were gatherings in parks, families meeting for food, friends watching fireworks, and neighborhoods filled with the sounds of celebration. For many people, the holiday represented freedom, happiness, and connection. For Delron Small and his family, it was meant to be a peaceful evening together. At 37 years old, Delron had already experienced many chapters of life. He was not a young man trying to discover who he was. He was someone who had responsibilities, relationships, and people who depended on him. He was a father. He was a partner. He was someone with a history that existed far beyond the moment that would later define him in newspapers and courtrooms. But the city did not know that yet. To the world, Delron Small would soon become a name connected to controversy. Before that night, however, he was simply a man living his life in Brooklyn. A man driving through familiar streets. A man heading home. The location where everything happened was near Atlantic Avenue and Bradford Street, an area shaped by the everyday rhythm of Brooklyn life. It was not a place where anyone expected history to be made. It was not a dangerous battlefield. It was a normal city intersection. Cars passed through. People moved around. Drivers dealt with the usual frustrations of urban traffic. A horn. A sudden stop. A disagreement. These things happened every day. Most people forgot them moments later. But on this particular night, a traffic-related encounter would become a chain of events that could not be reversed. The importance of the location would only become clear afterward. Investigators would return to that street. Lawyers would study the area. Video footage would be reviewed repeatedly. Every movement, every position, and every second would become part of a larger question. What exactly happened between two vehicles on Atlantic Avenue? To understand the tragedy, it is important to understand the environment surrounding it. New York City is a place where personal space is different from many other places. Millions of people live close together. Millions of strangers share roads, sidewalks, trains, and neighborhoods every day. This closeness creates a unique kind of tension. A person can feel anonymous in a crowd, but a small conflict can become intensely personal in seconds. A driver who feels disrespected may react emotionally. A person who feels threatened may respond defensively. And when weapons become part of that situation, the consequences can become permanent. For Wayne Isaacs, the other person at the center of this story, that night also began as something ordinary. Isaacs was a member of the New York Police Department. He was not working an active patrol shift at that moment. He was off-duty, wearing civilian clothing, but like many police officers, he was carrying a firearm. To him, the weapon was part of his identity as a police officer. It represented responsibility and protection. But it also meant that a confrontation involving him carried a different level of danger. A disagreement between two ordinary drivers might end with anger and frustration. A disagreement involving an armed police officer could end in a way that changed multiple lives forever. That difference would become central to the debate after Delron Small's death. Supporters of Isaacs would later argue that police officers, even when off-duty, must be allowed to protect themselves when they believe they are facing serious danger. Critics would argue that possessing a firearm also creates a greater responsibility to avoid unnecessary escalation. Those two ideas would collide during the investigation. But before investigators and attorneys examined the facts, the people involved were simply living through a normal night. Delron Small was traveling with his family. Wayne Isaacs was driving his own vehicle. Neither man knew that their paths were about to intersect in a way that would define their futures. The moments before the shooting are important because they reveal how quickly ordinary situations can become dangerous. There was no long history between the two men. They were not enemies. They were strangers. There was no personal conflict that had been building for months or years. There was only a brief encounter on the road. A moment of frustration. A moment where emotions rose. And a moment where both men interpreted the situation differently. That difference in perception became the heart of the case. For Delron Small's family, the situation was a disagreement that should have ended without violence. They believed he was angry, perhaps frustrated, but not someone who deserved to lose his life. They described him as a father who cared about his children and someone whose final actions were misunderstood. For Wayne Isaacs, the encounter was viewed through a different lens. He later said he believed he was facing a threat. He believed the approaching man was not simply an angry driver but someone who could harm him. The human mind can make rapid calculations during moments of fear. A person sees movement. A person hears words. A person interprets body language. And in a matter of seconds, the brain decides whether a situation is safe or dangerous. But the problem with those moments is that fear does not always tell the same story as reality. A movement that one person sees as aggression may be seen by another as confrontation. A raised voice may be interpreted as a threat by one person and frustration by another. The question that followed the shooting was whether Isaac's perception matched what was actually happening. That question would not be answered on the street that night. It would take months of investigation. It would take courtroom arguments. It would require people to look closely at a moment that lasted only seconds. The tragedy was that by the time anyone had the opportunity to carefully analyze what happened, Delron Small was already gone. The early morning hours of July 4th would become a turning point for everyone connected to the case. For the Small family, it would become the date they lost someone they loved. For Wayne Isaacs, it would become the moment that placed him at the center of a criminal investigation. For Brooklyn, it would become another painful conversation about trust, fear, and justice. The street where the shooting happened would no longer be just another intersection. It would become a place connected to questions that still had no easy answers. Could the confrontation have ended differently? Could someone have walked away? Could a few seconds of patience have prevented a lifetime of pain? Those questions would follow the case for years. Because the story of Delron Small was not only about what happened when the gun was fired. It was about everything that brought two strangers to that exact place at that exact moment. A holiday night. A Brooklyn street. Two vehicles. Two different perceptions. And a few seconds that changed everything before the courtroom debates. Before the news cameras arrived. Before his name became connected to a national conversation about police use of force, Delron Small was simply a man trying to live his life. To strangers, he would later become known through a single moment captured in a police report and discussed during a trial. But to the people who loved him, Delron was not a case number. He was not a headline. He was not a symbol. He was a father. A partner. A person with memories, relationships, dreams, and responsibilities. And like every person whose life ends suddenly, his story did not begin on the night he died. It began years before, in the quiet moments that no camera ever recorded. The conversations with family. The everyday routines. The small gestures that people often overlook until they are gone. Because when someone disappears unexpectedly, the world tends to remember the final moments. But families remember everything that came before. They remember the person who laughed. The person who worried. The person who made plans for the future. The person whose presence felt permanent. For Delron Small, that presence mattered deeply to those closest to him. At 37 years old, he was at a stage in life where many people are focused on building stability. He was not someone living without direction. He had a family that looked to him. He had children who knew him as their father. He had a partner who shared a life with him. He had responsibilities that continued beyond any single day. The image that would later appear in the media was often connected to controversy. But behind that image was a man whose family saw something completely different. They saw someone who had a role in their everyday lives. Someone whose absence would not simply be noticed. It would change everything. The hardest part of sudden loss is that there is no preparation. There is no gradual goodbye. There is no opportunity to say the things that people often wish they had said. One moment, a person is part of the family's future. The next moment, they exist only in memories. For Delron's family, that transformation happened in the middle of a holiday night. A night that should have been filled with happiness. A night when his children were supposed to remember celebration, not tragedy. One of the most painful details of the case was that Dilron was not alone when he died. His partner, Zaquana Albert, was there. His 5-month-old son was there. His partner's young daughter was there. The people closest to him witnessed the final moments of his life. They were not hearing about what happened later. They were not reading about it in the news. They were experiencing the confusion and fear in real time. For a family, losing someone is already devastating. But witnessing the loss can create another level of trauma. The memory becomes impossible to escape. The final moments replay again and again. Questions remain unanswered. The mind searches for a different ending. A different decision. A different outcome. What if the argument had never happened? What if one person had stayed inside the car? What if someone had simply driven away? Those questions often become a permanent part of grief. And for Dilron's family, those questions would remain long after the investigation ended. One of the most important parts of understanding this case is recognizing that Dilron Small was not defined by the final seconds of his life. The circumstances surrounding his death created public debate, but his family's memories were built on years of experiences. A child does not remember a parent because of one moment. A partner does not love someone because of one night. A family does not lose a person because of a headline. They lose someone because of all the ordinary moments that disappear with them. The missing conversations. The missing celebrations. The missing guidance. The missing presence. For Dilron's young son, the loss was especially painful because he was only 5 months old. He was at an age where he would never have the opportunity to fully understand the father he lost. He would grow up hearing stories instead of creating new memories. He would know his father through photographs, family conversations, and the memories of others. There would be no future birthdays together. No lessons taught. No moments of watching his son grow into adulthood. The tragedy was not only that Dilron Small died. It was that a future was taken away. A father's future. A child's future. A family's future. This is often the part of violent deaths that statistics cannot show. Numbers can describe what happened. But they cannot describe what disappears afterward. They cannot measure the empty chair at a family gathering. They cannot measure the silence inside a home where someone used to be. They cannot measure the emotional weight carried by those left behind. When Dilron Small's family spoke about him after his death, they focused on the person they knew. They rejected the idea that he should be remembered only through the confrontation that ended his life. They wanted people to understand that before the argument, before the shooting, before the investigation, there was a human being. A man with a family. A man with people who loved him. A man who deserved to be remembered beyond the circumstances of his death. That desire is common among families who lose loved ones in controversial cases. They often feel that the public conversation becomes focused on the final moment, while the person's entire life becomes forgotten. A person becomes reduced to a single event. But human lives are not single events. They are thousands of moments connected together. Dilron Small's story was made of those moments. The conversations he had. The relationships he built. The responsibilities he carried. The love he gave to his family. The plans he still had. All of that existed before the night of July 4, 2016. And all of that was still true after he was gone. The tragedy of Dilron's death was intensified by the fact that the situation began with something so ordinary. A disagreement between drivers. A moment of anger. A misunderstanding. These are experiences that millions of people have every day. Most end with nothing more than frustration. Most people calm down. most people continue driving. But that night, the normal rules of everyday life disappeared. A father who expected to return home never arrived. A family celebration became a crime scene. And a man who had spent 37 years building a life became remembered for the final seconds he spent on a Brooklyn street. The public would later debate whether Delron Small was a threat or a victim. The courtroom would debate whether Wayne Isaacs acted lawfully. But his family had a different focus. They wanted people to remember Delron as a person. Not as a controversy. Not as an argument. Not as a moment frozen in time. They wanted the world to know that behind every case involving a death, there is always a life that came before. A life filled with ordinary days that felt endless. A life filled with people who cared. A life that mattered. On the night he died, Delron Small was simply trying to get home. He was a father traveling with his family. He was someone who believed there would be another morning. Another conversation. Another ordinary day. He did not know that his story was approaching its final chapter. He did not know that a few moments on Atlantic Avenue would change everything. And he could never have imagined that years later, people would still be asking the same question. How did a simple encounter between two strangers end with one man losing his life and an entire family losing their future? The night of July 4, 2016, began like thousands of other nights in New York City. People were returning home. Families were finishing celebrations. Cars moved through the streets carrying people who were tired, distracted, or simply ready to end the night. Nobody driving through Brooklyn at that moment knew they were moving toward a scene that would later become the center of a national debate. Nobody knew that a few seconds of anger between two drivers would lead to a death investigation. Nobody knew that a father's final moments were about to unfold on an ordinary street. For Delron Small, the night was supposed to end quietly. He had spent time with his family during the holiday weekend. He was traveling with his partner, Zaquana Albert, their 5-month-old son, and Albert's young daughter. Inside the vehicle, there was a family returning from an evening together. The kind of moment that thousands of families experience every day. A late drive home. Children in the back seat. A conversation between loved ones. A simple journey from one place to another. But somewhere along Atlantic Avenue, something changed. A disagreement between two drivers began. At first, it was only a moment of frustration. A situation that, in another circumstance, might have ended with a gesture of annoyance, a few angry words, and then both drivers continuing in opposite directions. But this time, the encounter did not end. It escalated. The other vehicle belonged to Wayne Isaacs. Isaacs was a New York City police officer, though he was not working an official shift at the time. He was off-duty, dressed in civilian clothing, but he was carrying his firearm. That detail would become one of the most important parts of the case. Because the moment two strangers entered into conflict, one of them was not simply another driver. He was a police officer with a weapon. And the other was a man approaching his vehicle during an angry exchange. The exact sequence of events became the subject of intense disagreement. Different people saw different things. Different people remembered different details. And because the entire confrontation happened so quickly, every second became extremely important. According to the account given by Wayne Isaacs, the situation became frightening almost immediately. Isaacs said that Delron Small approached his vehicle in an aggressive manner. He claimed Small was angry, yelling, and acting in a way that made him fear for his safety. Isaacs later stated that Small struck him through the vehicle window, causing him to believe he was facing an immediate threat. From Isaacs' perspective, this was not simply a traffic argument. He believed the situation had become dangerous. He believed he needed to protect himself. But the family of Delron Small saw the moment very differently. They did not believe Dilron was trying to seriously harm anyone. They believed he was upset during a road dispute, but that the situation did not justify deadly force. They argued that he was unarmed. They argued that the confrontation happened too quickly. And they questioned whether there was enough time for Isaacs to truly believe his life was in danger. Those two versions of the same moment would become the foundation of the entire legal battle. One version was built around fear. The other was built around loss. And between them was a man who would never be able to tell his own story. The encounter happened near Atlantic Avenue and Bradford Street in Brooklyn. The area was quiet compared with the daytime rush of the city. The late-night streets carried fewer vehicles. The holiday atmosphere was still present, but the normal energy of the day had faded. It was in this setting that a confrontation unfolded in seconds. According to investigators, Isaacs fired 3 shots. 3 pulls of a trigger. 3 moments that transformed a disagreement into a fatal shooting. Dilron Small was struck by gunfire. The father who had been traveling with his family moments earlier was now critically injured. The people closest to him were suddenly facing a reality they could never have imagined. The person sitting beside them was dying. The person they expected to walk through the door at home would not return. The scene that followed was one of confusion and shock. A family outing had become a nightmare. A normal street had become a crime scene. And the questions began almost immediately. Why did the encounter become deadly? Was there another way this could have ended? Could someone have walked away? Could the situation have stopped before the gun was ever drawn? These questions would follow the case for years. But in those first moments, there was no courtroom. There were no attorneys. There were no legal arguments. There was only the immediate aftermath of a shooting. The sound of gunfire had replaced the ordinary sounds of the street. A family was trying to understand what had just happened. Witnesses were trying to understand what they had seen. And investigators were beginning the difficult task of reconstructing a moment that had lasted only seconds. One of the greatest challenges in cases like this is that human memory does not work like a recording device. People remember emotions. They remember fear. They remember movement. They remember what they believed they were seeing. But during moments of extreme stress, details can become complicated. A person may believe something happened one way while another person experiences the same event completely differently. That is why evidence becomes so important. Not just what people say, but what can be proven. In the days following the shooting, attention turned toward surveillance footage. A camera had captured part of the encounter. The video would later become one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the case. For Dilron Small's family, the footage raised painful questions. They believed it showed a man approaching a vehicle and being shot almost immediately. They argued that the video did not clearly show the violent attack described by Isaacs. To them, the footage represented a moment that could not be ignored. For prosecutors, the video became a critical piece of evidence that required careful examination. They wanted to know whether the force used by Isaacs was truly necessary. Whether the officer's fear matched the actual level of danger. Whether the decision to fire was reasonable. But for Wayne Isaacs and his defense team, the video did not tell the entire story. They argued that a camera angle could not capture everything a person experiences in the moment. It could not show fear. It could not show perception. It could not show what was happening inside Isaac's mind during those seconds. And that became the central conflict. Should the decision be judged by what happened objectively? Or by what a reasonable person in Isaac's position might have believed was happening at that moment? That question would eventually be placed before a jury. But before the courtroom, there was a family dealing with unimaginable grief. Zaquana Albert had lost her partner. A young child had lost a father. A family had lost someone who was expected to be there for years to come. The legal system would later debate responsibility. The public would debate justice. But for those who loved Delron Small, the pain was immediate and personal. A man who left home that night never came back. And everything changed in the space of only a few seconds. The shooting of Delron Small would become known as one of the most controversial police-related cases in New York during that period. But before it became a legal battle, it was a tragedy. A tragedy created by a brief encounter between two people who did not know each other. Two people who entered the same moment with completely different perceptions. One believed he was facing danger. The other believed he was confronting a problem that could be solved with words. And when those two realities collided, the result was irreversible. A father was gone. A family was devastated. And the questions surrounding those final seconds on Atlantic Avenue had only just begun. In the moments after the gunshots echoed through the streets of Brooklyn, the meaning of what had happened was not immediately clear. For some people nearby, it was a sudden burst of chaos. A few seconds earlier, Atlantic Avenue had been just another city street. Cars were passing. People were moving through the night. The holiday weekend continued around them. Then everything changed. A confrontation between two drivers had turned into a deadly shooting. And as Delron Small lay on the ground, the first questions began to emerge. What happened? Who started the confrontation? Was the shooting justified? Could it have been prevented? In the early stages of any investigation, the scene itself becomes the first witness. Before detectives interview people. Before attorneys make arguments. Before a courtroom examines every detail. There is the physical evidence left behind. The location. The positions of the vehicles. The bullet casings. The injuries. The video recordings. The small details that can help reconstruct a moment that lasted only seconds. For investigators, the scene near Atlantic Avenue and Bradford Street became the place where they had to separate facts from assumptions. A man had been shot. A police officer had fired his weapon. And the difference between a justified shooting and an unlawful killing depended on understanding exactly what happened before those 3 shots were fired. The first moments after the shooting were filled with confusion. Delron Small's family was suddenly forced into a nightmare. The people who had been sitting beside him moments earlier were now witnesses to his final moments. They were not strangers watching from a distance. They were the people who knew him best. They knew the sound of his voice. They knew his personality. They knew who he was beyond that single confrontation. And now they were trying to understand how a family drive had turned into a tragedy. For investigators arriving at the scene, the situation was complicated from the beginning. The person who had fired the weapon was not an ordinary civilian. Wayne Isaacs was a police officer. Even though he was off duty, he was still a member of the NYPD. That meant the investigation carried additional attention and scrutiny. When a police officer uses deadly force, the question is never only what happened in that specific moment. The public also asks larger questions. Was the officer trained properly? Was the response necessary? Was the force proportional to the threat? Could another option have been used? These questions were already part of a national conversation in America at the time. Across the country, communities were debating police shootings and accountability. Every new case brought renewed attention. Every piece of evidence became heavily analyzed. And the death of Delron Small quickly entered that wider discussion. One of the most important pieces of evidence in the investigation was surveillance footage from the area. The existence of video changed the direction of the case. Without video, investigators would have relied mainly on statements from those involved and eyewitness accounts. But the camera provided another perspective. A silent record of at least part of what happened. The footage did not capture every detail. It did not record every word spoken. It did not reveal what was happening inside the minds of the two men. But it showed movement, distance, timing. And those elements became extremely important. According to the family of Delron Small, the video challenged the explanation that he represented an immediate deadly threat. They believed the footage showed Small approaching the vehicle and being shot almost instantly. They argued that there was not enough time for a meaningful threat to develop before Isaacs fired. For them, the video raised a painful question. How could a man be considered dangerous enough to die when the confrontation appeared to happen so quickly? But for Wayne Isaacs, the footage did not erase the fear he experienced. His defense would later argue that video alone could not capture the full reality of the moment. A camera could show where someone moved, but it could not show what that person was doing. It could not fully explain body language. It could not reveal the words exchanged. It could not show whether Isaacs believed he was about to be harmed. This difference between what a camera sees and what a person experiences would become one of the central issues of the trial. Investigators also examined witness statements. In cases involving sudden violence, witnesses often remember the same event differently. One person may focus on movement. Another may focus on words. Another may remember only the sound of gunshots and the panic that followed. Human memory during stressful events is complicated. Fear can affect perception. Distance can affect what someone sees. Noise can make communication difficult. And when an event happens within seconds, even honest witnesses may describe it differently. That did not mean their experiences were unimportant. It meant investigators had to carefully compare every account. They had to look for consistency. They had to determine which details were supported by physical evidence. They had to build a timeline. The timeline was critical, because the entire case depended on what happened between the moment Delron Small approached the vehicle and the moment the shots were fired. Was there enough time for Isaacs to reasonably believe he was facing serious danger? Or did the shooting happen before the situation reached that level? That question became the center of the investigation. Another important element was the fact that Delron Small was not carrying a weapon. His family emphasized this repeatedly. To them, the absence of a weapon was evidence that he was not the threat described by Isaacs. They believed that a disagreement had escalated unnecessarily. But legally, the presence or absence of a weapon was only one part of the analysis. A person does not need to have a weapon to create a threat. At the same time, the use of deadly force requires more than a person simply being angry or approaching someone. The investigators had to examine the totality of the circumstances. The physical evidence. The statements. The video. The actions of both men. The moments before the shooting. And the moments immediately after. Every detail mattered. A few steps. A few words. A few seconds. The investigation also focused on Wayne Isaacs himself. As a police officer, he had training in dealing with dangerous situations. That raised another difficult question. Did his training influence what he did? Should an experienced officer have handled the situation differently? Or was his response reasonable given what he believed was happening? Supporters of Isaacs argued that officers cannot be expected to wait until they are seriously injured before protecting themselves. They pointed out that dangerous situations can develop quickly. They argued that hesitation can cost a person their life. Critics responded that police officers also carry a higher responsibility because they have the authority and training to use deadly force. They argued that when someone has a firearm, the decision to use it must be carefully controlled. The investigation became more than a search for facts. It became a debate about responsibility. Where is the line between fear and excessive force? When does self-defense become unnecessary violence? How should society judge a decision made in seconds? These questions were not easy. And they would not be answered quickly. As investigators continued their work, Dilron Small's family began their own search for answers. They wanted to know why their loved one was dead. They wanted accountability. They wanted people to see Dilron not as a moment of controversy, but as a person whose life had been taken away. Meanwhile, Wayne Isaacs faced a completely different reality. A single night had transformed him from a police officer into the subject of a criminal investigation. His career, reputation, and future were now connected to one decision made on a Brooklyn street. The evidence collected from Atlantic Avenue would eventually determine what happened next. The video footage, the witness accounts, the forensic details. All of it would move the case forward. But before there could be justice, there had to be an investigation. And investigators were now facing the most difficult task of all. Reconstructing 10 seconds that changed 2 lives forever. One man was dead. Another man was facing the possibility of prison. And an entire city was waiting for the answer to one question. What really happened on Atlantic Avenue that night, after the shooting of Dilron Small? The street where it happened became the beginning of a long and complicated search for answers. The physical scene would eventually be cleaned. The vehicles would be removed. The investigators would leave. The people who lived nearby would return to their normal routines. But for the families involved, nothing would ever return to normal. For Dilron Small's loved ones, the investigation represented a desperate attempt to understand how a father, partner, and family member could leave home one night and never return. For Wayne Isaacs, the investigation represented something entirely different. It was the moment when every decision he made in those few seconds would be examined under a microscope. Every movement, every word, every action. The question was no longer only what happened. The question was why it happened. And in cases involving deadly force, understanding the reason behind an action is often the most difficult part. Because the investigation was not simply trying to determine whether Wayne Isaacs fired the gun. That fact was never disputed. He admitted that he fired. The question was whether he was legally justified in doing so. Was he a police officer protecting himself from a threat? Or was he an armed man who reacted too quickly during a confrontation that could have ended differently? Those competing interpretations shaped everything that followed. Investigators began examining the available evidence piece by piece. The surveillance footage became one of the most important elements. The video was not a perfect recording of every detail. It did not provide a clear view of every movement. It did not capture the entire conversation between the two men. But it provided something extremely valuable. A timeline. In a case where seconds mattered, timing was everything. The footage showed Dilron Small approaching the vehicle. It showed the distance between him and Isaacs. It showed the moments before the shots were fired. To prosecutors and Small's family, the footage raised serious concerns. They argued that the video appeared to show a man approaching a vehicle and being shot almost immediately. They questioned whether there was enough time for Isaacs to truly determine that he faced a deadly threat. They believed the shooting happened before the situation reached the level where deadly force was necessary. But Wayne Isaacs and his defense team viewed the same evidence through a different lens. They argued that the video did not show everything. A camera could not capture fear. A camera could not record the thoughts running through a person's mind. A camera could not fully show the emotional intensity of a confrontation happening only a few feet away. From Isaac's perspective, the danger was not something that developed slowly. It was something that happened instantly. He believed a man was approaching him aggressively. He believed that man had already crossed a line. And he believed he needed to act before he was harmed. The investigation had to examine not only what Delrawn Small did, but what Isaacs reasonably believed was happening at that moment. This distinction became one of the most important legal issues in the entire case. In many self-defense cases, the law does not judge a person's actions based only on the final outcome. It examines whether the person had a reasonable belief that they were facing serious danger. The challenge was determining whether that belief was justified. And that required investigators, prosecutors, and eventually jurors to place themselves inside a moment that lasted only seconds. They had to imagine the scene. 2 men. 2 vehicles. A heated encounter. 1 person approaching. 1 person with a firearm. A decision made almost instantly. The investigation also looked closely at the background of Wayne Isaacs. As an NYPD officer, he was familiar with confrontation. He had received training in how to respond during dangerous encounters. This became an important part of the public debate. Some people argued that his experience should have allowed him to handle the situation without using deadly force. They believed his training gave him more options than an ordinary person might have had. Others argued the opposite. They believed his experience as an officer meant he understood the risks of confrontation and had a right to defend himself when he believed he was in danger. The role of police training became a complicated issue. A police officer is trained to protect lives. But police officers are also human beings. They can experience fear. They can make rapid judgments. They can misunderstand situations. The investigation had to consider both realities. Meanwhile, the emotional impact on Delrawn Small's family continued to grow. For them, the investigation was not an abstract legal process. Every delay meant more time without answers. Every legal argument reopened the pain. They were forced to hear descriptions of the final moments of someone they loved. They had to listen as strangers debated the character of the man they knew personally. This is one of the most difficult experiences for families involved in controversial deaths. They are not only grieving. They are also defending the memory of the person they lost. They often feel that the world is judging their loved one based only on the final moments of their life. But a person's entire existence cannot be reduced to one confrontation. Delrawn Small was a father before he became a case. He was a partner before he became evidence. He was a person before he became part of a public debate. As the investigation continued, prosecutors faced a difficult decision. Was there enough evidence to bring criminal charges against Wayne Isaacs? Charging a police officer with a crime involving deadly force is one of the most serious decisions prosecutors can make. It requires determining whether the evidence suggests criminal wrongdoing rather than simply a tragic outcome. The standard is high. The evidence must show more than disagreement. It must show that the officer's actions crossed the legal boundary. The case attracted significant attention because it came during a period when police shootings were under intense national scrutiny. Communities across America were questioning how officers used force and whether accountability systems were strong enough. Every case became part of a larger conversation. But for investigators, the focus had to remain on the specific facts. Not politics. Not public pressure. Not national arguments. Only the evidence surrounding Delrawn Small's death. As months passed, investigators continued collecting information. They reviewed reports. They examined testimony. They studied the surveillance footage repeatedly. They analyzed the physical evidence. The goal was to create a complete picture of what happened during those final moments. But every piece of evidence seemed to lead back to the same difficult question. How much danger was actually present before the shots were fired? Because the entire case rested on that moment. If Isaacs truly believed he was facing serious harm, then his actions could be viewed as self-defense. If that belief was unreasonable, then the shooting could be considered unlawful. The difference between those two conclusions was enormous. One could mean a justified act by an officer under threat. The other could mean a wrongful killing. And determining which one was true would become the responsibility of the justice system. Eventually, after the investigation gathered enough information, the case moved into a new phase. Wayne Isaacs would no longer be only the officer who fired the shots. He would become a defendant. A courtroom would become the next battlefield. Evidence would replace assumptions. Witnesses would tell their stories. Lawyers would challenge each other's interpretations. And a jury would eventually have to decide whether the shooting of Delron Small was a crime or a tragic act of self-defense. But before that decision could be made, the prosecution would first have to answer a crucial question. Was there enough evidence to say that Wayne Isaacs crossed the line? The investigation had reached its most important stage. The search for answers had led to a confrontation between two competing realities. A father who was gone. A police officer facing trial. And a city waiting to find out what justice would look like. For months after the shooting of Delron Small, the investigation existed in a difficult space between certainty and uncertainty. Everyone knew the basic facts. A man was dead. A police officer had fired 3 shots. A family had been destroyed. But the most important question remained unanswered. Was the shooting a justified act of self-defense, or was it an unnecessary use of deadly force? The answer depended on understanding a moment that lasted only seconds. And in cases like this, seconds can be the hardest thing to understand. Because the difference between a lawful shooting and an unlawful killing can exist in a fraction of time. A step forward. A movement of an arm. A change in distance. A decision made under pressure. That was the challenge facing investigators. They were not simply examining an event. They were reconstructing a moment. A moment where fear, anger, confusion, and instinct all collided. At first, the story surrounding Delron Small's death appeared to follow a familiar pattern. A police officer had fired his weapon. The officer said he feared for his safety. The person who was shot was no longer alive to explain his own actions. In many cases involving police shootings, the initial explanation can strongly influence public perception. The first statements released after an incident often shape the way people understand what happened. And in the beginning, the explanation provided by Wayne Isaacs focused on one central point. He believed he was under attack. According to Isaacs, Delron Small had approached his vehicle aggressively during a road dispute. He said Small's actions caused him to fear that he was about to be harmed. He believed he had only moments to react. But as investigators continued examining the case, one piece of evidence became increasingly important. The surveillance video. The footage did not answer every question. It did not capture every word exchanged between the two men. It did not reveal every thought that passed through their minds. But it provided something powerful. A visual record of the physical movements leading up to the shooting. And that changed the conversation. The video became the center of debate because it appeared to challenge parts of the initial narrative. For Delron Small's family, the footage was devastating. They believed it showed a man approaching a vehicle who was immediately met with gunfire. They argued that the video did not show the kind of violent attack that would justify taking someone's life. To them, the footage represented the truth that they believed had been missing. It showed that Delron was unarmed. It showed the speed of the encounter. It showed how quickly the situation ended. But for Wayne Isaacs, the same footage told a different story. His defense argued that the video could not show everything that happened. A camera angle could not reveal the emotional intensity of the moment. It could not show what Isaacs saw from inside his vehicle. It could not capture the fear he said he experienced. It could not explain why he believed he needed to act immediately. This conflict between visible evidence and personal perception became the heart of the case. The prosecution focused on what could be seen. The defense focused on what could not be seen. And between those two arguments was the difficult question of reasonableness. What would a reasonable person in that situation have believed? Would they have believed they were facing serious danger? Or would they have recognized that the situation had not reached that level? The video forced everyone involved to look closely at the timeline. The investigators, the prosecutors, the defense team, eventually, the jury. Every second mattered. Because the entire case depended on what happened between the moment Dealraun approached the vehicle and the moment Isaacs fired. The investigation also gained attention because of who was involved. Wayne Isaacs was not just another defendant. He was a police officer. At a time when communities across America were demanding greater accountability from law enforcement, the case carried significance beyond Brooklyn. Many people saw it as another example of a larger national issue. Questions about police authority. Questions about accountability. Questions about whether officers involved in deadly force incidents were held to the same standards as ordinary citizens. For supporters of Isaacs, the criticism was unfair. They argued that police officers face unpredictable dangers and must be allowed to make decisions in rapidly developing situations. They believed that officers should not be punished simply because a situation ended tragically. For critics, however, the issue was not whether officers could defend themselves. The issue was whether the level of force used was necessary. They argued that carrying a firearm creates an enormous responsibility. A police officer has the power to end a life in seconds. Therefore, that decision must be carefully examined. The growing public attention placed additional pressure on prosecutors. Charging a police officer is never a simple decision. The legal system must balance many factors. The evidence, the law, the circumstances, the intent. A tragic outcome alone is not always enough for criminal charges. Prosecutors must determine whether the evidence supports the claim that a crime occurred. In the case of Dealraun Small, they ultimately concluded that the evidence raised serious enough questions to move forward. Wayne Isaacs was charged with second-degree murder and first-degree manslaughter. The decision immediately intensified public discussion. For Dealraun's supporters, the charges represented a step toward accountability. They believed the case deserved a full examination in court. They wanted a jury to hear the evidence. They wanted the circumstances surrounding Small's death to be publicly challenged. For Isaacs and his supporters, the charges represented the criminalization of a police officer who believed he was protecting his own life. They argued that he should not be treated as a criminal for reacting to a perceived threat. The case was now moving from investigation to prosecution. The questions would no longer remain only in reports and interviews. They would be tested in a courtroom. But before that happened, prosecutors had to build their case. They had to explain why the evidence showed that Isaac's actions crossed the legal boundary. They had to convince a jury that the shooting was not simply unfortunate, but unlawful. That meant presenting a clear timeline. A clear explanation. A clear argument about what happened in those final seconds. The breakthrough in the case was not a single piece of evidence that solved everything. It was the realization that the entire case would depend on interpretation. The same moments could be viewed in two completely different ways. One person saw a threat. Another person saw a tragedy. One side saw an officer protecting himself. The other saw a father losing his life. The courtroom would eventually become the place where those two realities collided. But before the trial began, one thing had already become clear. The death of Dealraun Small would not disappear into another police report. The video had changed the conversation. The charges had changed the stakes. And the search for justice had entered its most important chapter. A jury would soon have to decide what happened during those final seconds on Atlantic Avenue. A decision that would determine not only the future of Wayne Isaacs, but also how Delron Small's death would be remembered. The courtroom is a place where moments are stretched apart. On the street, the confrontation between Delron Small and Wayne Isaacs lasted only seconds. A brief encounter. A sudden movement. A burst of gunfire. A life lost. But inside the courtroom, those same seconds would be examined for days. Every frame of surveillance footage. Every witness statement. Every word spoken afterward. Every detail that could help answer the question that had followed the case from the beginning. Was Wayne Isaacs justified in pulling the trigger? Or did Delron Small die because an argument that should have ended with words became a situation where deadly force was used too quickly? In 2017, the case reached trial in Brooklyn. The courtroom became the place where two completely different versions of the same night would be presented. For the family of Delron Small, this was not simply a legal proceeding. It was the moment they had been waiting for. A chance for the evidence to be examined publicly. A chance for people to hear who Delron was beyond the headlines. A chance for the justice system to decide what happened. But for Wayne Isaacs, the trial represented something equally significant. His freedom. His career. His reputation. Everything depended on how the jury interpreted those final moments on Atlantic Avenue. The prosecution entered the courtroom with a clear argument. They believed the evidence showed that Isaacs had used deadly force without sufficient justification. Their central point was that Delron Small did not pose a threat serious enough to justify being killed. They focused heavily on the surveillance video. The footage became one of the most important pieces of evidence presented during the trial. The prosecution argued that the video showed Small approaching the vehicle and being shot almost immediately. They told jurors to pay close attention to the timeline. How long did the confrontation actually last? How much time passed between Small approaching the vehicle and Isaacs firing? Was there enough opportunity for Isaacs to truly believe he was facing deadly danger? The prosecution wanted the jury to see the shooting not as a chaotic, unavoidable moment, but as a decision made too quickly. They argued that the situation was a road rage confrontation that escalated unnecessarily. In their view, anger and frustration had transformed a minor dispute into a fatal encounter. They believed Isaacs had the ability to make another choice. He could have driven away. He could have avoided escalation. He could have waited. Instead, they argued, he used his firearm. The defense presented a very different picture. Wayne Isaacs' attorneys argued that the prosecution was judging the situation with information that Isaacs did not have at the time. They argued that people watching the video from the safety of a courtroom had the luxury of knowing the outcome. Isaacs did not. He was inside his vehicle. He was facing an angry person approaching him. He had only moments to decide whether he was in danger. The defense reminded jurors that self-defense cases are not judged with perfect hindsight. They argued that the important question was not, was Delron Small actually going to seriously hurt him? The question was, did Wayne Isaacs reasonably believe he was facing serious harm at that moment? That difference was crucial. Because the law recognizes that people sometimes must make decisions under pressure. A person cannot always wait until danger becomes unavoidable. They cannot always know what another person intends. They must react based on what they perceive. And according to Isaac's defense team, his perception was that he was facing an immediate threat. The trial also forced jurors to consider the complicated reality of human reactions during moments of fear. Fear can change how people process information. A person who believes they are about to be attacked may not think slowly and carefully. They may react instinctively. They may focus on survival. But the prosecution argued that fear alone could not justify deadly force. They argued that the threat must be real and reasonable. The jury had to decide where that line existed. Throughout the trial, the character of Delron Small also became an important issue. His family wanted him remembered as a father and loved one. They believed the public conversation had focused too much on the confrontation and not enough on the man who lost his life. They emphasized that Delron was unarmed. They emphasized that he was a father. They emphasized that his children would have to grow up without him. For them, the question was not only about what happened in those seconds. It was about the value of the life that was taken. The defense, however, focused on the circumstances of the encounter itself. They did not argue that Delron's death was not tragic. Instead, they argued that tragedy does not automatically mean a crime occurred. Their position was that Isaacs was placed in a situation where he feared for his own life and responded accordingly. The trial became a confrontation between two ideas of justice. One side focused on the loss of an unarmed man. The other focused on the rights of an officer who believed he was under attack. Both arguments reflected real concerns. Both reflected fears that existed beyond the courtroom. For communities concerned about police accountability, the case represented a familiar question. When someone dies during an encounter with police, who is held responsible? For police officers and their supporters, the case represented another concern. Can officers protect themselves without fear that every split-second decision will later be judged as a crime? These questions made the trial larger than one incident. But inside the courtroom, the jury's responsibility was narrower. They were not deciding the entire debate about policing in America. They were deciding one specific case. One night. One confrontation. One shooting. The evidence had to lead them to a conclusion beyond reasonable doubt. After hearing testimony and reviewing the evidence, the jury began deliberations. For the Small family, this was another painful waiting period. They had already lost Delron. Now they had to wait to see whether the legal system would recognize his death as a crime. For Wayne Isaacs, the waiting carried a different weight. His future was in the hands of 12 people who had to decide whether his actions were justified. The jury examined the evidence. They considered the testimony. They reviewed the arguments from both sides. And eventually, they reached their decision. Wayne Isaacs was found not guilty of murder and manslaughter charges. The verdict meant that the jury did not believe prosecutors had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Isaacs committed a crime. Legally, the case was over. But emotionally, the case was far from finished. For Isaacs and his supporters, the verdict represented recognition that he had acted in self-defense. They believed the jury understood the difficult position he faced. For Delron Small's family and supporters, the verdict brought a different reaction. They felt that justice had not been served. They believed that an unarmed father had lost his life and that the legal system had failed to hold anyone accountable. The courtroom decision could answer a legal question. But it could not erase the pain. It could not bring Delron back. It could not give his children the years with their father that had been taken away. It could not undo what happened on Atlantic Avenue. The trial ended, but the debate continued. Because the case had never been only about one verdict. It was about the difficult space between fear and responsibility. Between self-defense and excessive force. Between what a person believes in a moment of danger and what others later see when they examine that moment from the outside. The jury had made its decision. But the question that began the case remained alive in the minds of many people. Could those final seconds have ended differently? For Delron Small's family, the answer would always be yes. Because for them, justice was not only about what happened in a courtroom. It was about the life that was lost before the courtroom doors ever opened. The courtroom doors eventually closed. The arguments were finished. The evidence had been presented. The jury had reached its decision. Wayne Isaacs was found not guilty of the charges connected to the shooting death of Delrawn Small. Legally, the case had reached its conclusion. But for many people connected to the tragedy, there was no sense of an ending. Because a verdict can close a criminal case. It cannot close a wound. For Delrawn Small's family, the announcement did not bring back the person they had lost. It did not change the empty spaces left behind. It did not give a father back to his children. It did not erase the memory of that night on Atlantic Avenue. The justice system had answered one question: whether Wayne Isaacs was criminally responsible beyond a reasonable doubt. But the family continued to carry another question. Why did Delrawn Small have to die at all? That question was much harder to answer. Because the loss they experienced was not measured in legal definitions. It was measured in birthdays that would never happen. Conversations that would never take place. Family moments that would never be created. A child growing older without his father. A partner continuing life without the person she expected to share it with. The aftermath of a controversial death is often complicated because there are multiple realities happening at the same time. For one person, the case may be over. For another, the pain has only just begun. For Wayne Isaacs, the verdict meant he would not face criminal punishment. But the shooting would remain a defining moment in his life. He had gone from being a New York police officer to becoming the center of a national conversation about police use of force. His name became connected to a case that would follow him long after the courtroom decision. For Delrawn Small's loved ones, the attention was different. They were not trying to defend a career. They were trying to preserve a memory. They wanted people to remember that before the shooting, before the investigation, and before the trial, there was a person. A father. A partner. A family member. They believed the circumstances of his death had overshadowed the story of his life. And for many families who lose loved ones in controversial cases, this becomes one of the greatest struggles. The world remembers the event. The family remembers the person. The world discusses evidence. The family remembers laughter. The world debates responsibility. The family remembers love. Delrawn Small became part of a larger national conversation about policing in America. His name appeared alongside other cases involving questions about the use of deadly force. Communities across the country were asking difficult questions. How should officers respond when they feel threatened? How much authority should police have during uncertain situations? How can society hold officers accountable while recognizing the dangers they face? These questions do not have simple answers. They involve competing values. Safety. Accountability. Trust. Justice. The case of Delrawn Small existed at the intersection of all of them. For supporters of police officers, the verdict represented an important principle. They believed that officers should not be punished for making decisions in moments where they genuinely fear for their lives. They argued that danger can appear suddenly. They argued that police officers are human beings who must sometimes react quickly. From this perspective, Wayne Isaacs was a man placed in a frightening situation who acted to survive. But for critics and for those who supported Delrawn Small's family, the verdict represented something painful. They believed that the system had failed to fully recognize the value of an unarmed man's life. They questioned whether the standard for using deadly force gave too much protection to officers. They argued that accountability must exist when someone dies during a police encounter. These disagreements reflected a much larger national struggle. But behind the debate was still one family living with a personal tragedy. The most painful part of Delrawn Small's story was not the courtroom. It was everything that came after. The ordinary days when his absence became impossible to ignore. The moments when his children needed him. The family events where someone was missing. The memories that became reminders of what had been taken away. Grief does not follow the timeline of a trial. It does not end when a judge leaves the courtroom. It does not disappear when a verdict is announced. It changes. It becomes part of everyday life. For Dilron's loved ones, remembering him became a way of keeping his presence alive. They wanted his story to include more than the circumstances of his death. They wanted people to understand that his life had meaning before that night. And eventually, his name would become permanently connected to the community where he lived. A section of Brooklyn was later honored with the name Dilron Small Way. The street designation served as a reminder that behind the public debate was a real person. Someone who had family. Someone who had dreams. Someone whose life mattered. A memorial name cannot replace a person. A street sign cannot fill an empty seat at home. But for families, these acts of remembrance can carry deep meaning. They create a place where a person's identity is preserved. They remind future generations that someone lived there. Someone was loved there. Someone was lost. The story of Dilron Small also raised questions about the moments before tragedy. Many people looking back at the case wondered how two strangers could move from a traffic disagreement to a deadly confrontation. How did frustration become fear? How did fear become violence? How did a few seconds erase decades of life? These questions are not only legal questions. They are human questions. Because conflicts happen every day. People become angry every day. People misunderstand each other every day. Most of those moments end without permanent consequences. But sometimes, a combination of circumstances creates a tragedy. A person's emotional state. A person's perception. A weapon being present. A decision made under pressure. All of these elements can combine into a moment where there is no chance to undo what happens next. That is what makes the death of Dilron Small so difficult to understand. The situation was not the result of a long-standing conflict between enemies. It was not a planned act. It was a brief encounter between two strangers. Two people whose lives crossed for only a few moments. And yet, those few moments changed everything. Years after the shooting, the debate surrounding the case continued. Some remembered it as an example of an officer facing a dangerous situation. Others remembered it as an example of the dangers of rapid escalation and the consequences of deadly force. But beyond all arguments, one fact remained unchanged. Dilron Small was gone. A family had lost someone they loved. A child had lost a father. A community had lost one of its members. And no verdict could change that reality. The final legacy of Dilron Small's story is not only about the question of guilt or innocence. It is about the fragility of ordinary moments. A simple drive home. A family together in a car. A conversation that could have ended differently. A few seconds that separated an ordinary night from an irreversible tragedy. Because sometimes the most devastating moments in life do not arrive with a warning. They begin quietly. They begin with something small. And by the time people realize what is happening, everything has already changed. Years can pass after a tragedy. The headlines disappear. The cameras leave. The courtroom becomes quiet again. The names of lawyers, witnesses, and legal arguments slowly fade from public attention. But for the people who lived through the loss, time does not erase what happened. It only changes the way they carry it. The death of Dilron Small remains one of those cases where the legal conclusion did not end the emotional debate. A jury reached a verdict. Wayne Isaacs was found not guilty. The criminal case was closed. But the deeper questions surrounding that night on Atlantic Avenue continued to exist. Questions about fear. Questions about judgment. Questions about responsibility. Questions about how quickly an ordinary conflict can become something irreversible. Because the most difficult part of the Deal Ron Small case is that both sides of the story begin with something human. Fear is human. Anger is human. Frustration is human. The desire to protect oneself is human. But so is the pain of losing someone who did not come home. And that is what makes this case so complicated. It is not a story where everyone can easily separate into heroes and villains. It is a story about a moment where decisions were made under pressure, and the consequences lasted forever. For Deal Ron Small's family, the unanswered questions were not legal theories. They were personal. They were questions that came during quiet moments. Questions that appeared when they looked at old photographs. Questions that came when they watched his children grow. Questions that returned during birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings. What would Deal Ron have been like as his son grew older? What advice would he have given? What memories would they have created together? These are questions that no courtroom can answer. A trial can decide whether someone is criminally responsible. It cannot restore the future that was lost. The legal system works with evidence, standards, and definitions. Families experience loss through memories, emotions, and absence. Those two realities often exist side by side. A court may say one thing. A grieving family may feel another. Both can exist at the same time. The case also raised broader questions about the relationship between police officers and the communities they serve. A police officer's job requires making decisions in unpredictable situations. Officers are often placed in moments where they must quickly evaluate danger. They may not have time to carefully analyze every possibility. Supporters of law enforcement argue that society must recognize this reality. They believe officers cannot hesitate when they genuinely believe they are facing serious harm. A delay of only a few seconds could change whether an officer survives. From this perspective, Wayne Isaac's decision was a reaction to a threat that he believed was real. But critics argue that the power to use deadly force requires an extraordinary level of responsibility. A police officer carries authority that ordinary citizens do not have. An officer's weapon is not only a tool of protection. It is also a tool capable of ending a human life. Because of that, many people believe every use of deadly force must be carefully examined. They argue that officers should be trained to recognize opportunities for de-escalation. They argue that possessing a weapon should increase caution rather than reduce it. These opposing views are part of a larger conversation that continues across America. The Deal Ron Small case became one example of a much bigger question. How should society balance the safety of officers with the rights and safety of civilians? There is no simple answer. The reality is that police encounters can involve genuine danger. But the reality is also that mistakes during those encounters can have devastating consequences. The challenge is finding a system that protects both public safety and individual lives. Another important question raised by the case was the role of perception. Human beings do not respond only to what is happening. They respond to what they believe is happening. Two people can experience the same moment and interpret it completely differently. One person sees an aggressive movement. Another sees an attempt to communicate. One person sees danger. Another sees frustration. In the seconds before the shooting, Deal Ron Small and Wayne Isaacs may have been experiencing completely different realities. Isaacs believed he was facing a threat. Small's family believed he was simply confronting a traffic disagreement. The tragedy is that there was no opportunity afterward for those two interpretations to be reconciled. The moment ended with gunfire. And after that, only one person remained alive to explain his perspective. This is one of the painful realities of many deadly encounters. When someone dies, the world often tries to reconstruct their intentions through evidence. Through video. Through witness statements. Through legal arguments. But sometimes the person at the center of the event is no longer there to speak. That absence creates uncertainty. And uncertainty creates conflict. The surveillance video became one of the most debated parts of the case because it appeared to show some of what happened but not everything. It showed movement. It showed timing. It showed the physical sequence. But it could not show emotions. It could not show fear. It could not show thoughts. A camera can record an event. It cannot always explain an event. That limitation is one reason cases like Dilron Smalls remain so controversial. People look at the same evidence and see different truths. For some, the video confirmed their belief that deadly force was unnecessary. For others, the video did not change their belief that Isaacs faced a threat. The evidence existed. But interpretation remained. And that interpretation shaped how people remembered the case. For Dilron Smalls' family, the most important truth was simple. A father was gone. No legal argument could change that. No explanation could replace him. No verdict could return the years that had been taken away. His death created a permanent absence. A missing voice. A missing presence. A missing person in the everyday life of his family. The story of Dilron Smalls also serves as a reminder of how fragile ordinary moments can be. Many people experience road conflicts. Many people become angry while driving. Many people have moments where emotions rise. Usually, those moments disappear. But sometimes, one person makes one decision. Another person responds. And the situation becomes something nobody can reverse. The tragedy is not only what happened. It is what could have happened instead. A different reaction. A different choice. A moment of patience. A moment where someone decided to walk away. History is filled with moments where small decisions create enormous consequences. The Dilron Smalls case became one of those moments. A few seconds became years of investigation. A few seconds became a courtroom battle. A few seconds became a lifetime of grief for a family. And even after the legal process ended, the emotional questions remained. Could Dilron Smalls still be alive if someone had reacted differently? Could the confrontation have ended without violence? Could both men have simply driven away? No one can change what happened. The past cannot be rewritten. But remembering these questions is important because every tragedy carries lessons. The death of Dilron Smalls forces society to examine how people respond during moments of conflict. How fear influences decisions. How quickly situations can escalate. How much responsibility comes with power. And how every person involved in a critical moment leaves behind consequences that may last forever. Dilron Smalls' story is ultimately about more than a shooting. It is about a life interrupted. A family changed. And a moment that continues to challenge people to think about justice, accountability, and the value of human life. Because behind every controversial case, behind every legal argument, behind every public debate, there are people who must continue living afterward. And for the family of Dilron Smalls, life continued without the person they expected to have beside them. A father. A partner. A loved one. A man who left home one night and never returned. When a person dies in a highly publicized case, the world often remembers the event before it remembers the individual. The headlines focus on the confrontation. The debates focus on the evidence. The arguments focus on responsibility. But behind every public discussion is a private reality that continues long after the cameras disappear. A family still wakes up every morning without someone they love. A child still grows up with questions. A partner still carries memories of a life that was interrupted. For Dilron Small's family, the most important part of his story was never the courtroom. It was the life he lived before that night. The ordinary moments that shaped who he was. The relationships he built. The people who knew him not as a name in the news, but as a person. Because a human being cannot be defined by the final seconds of their life. A person is not only the way they died. They are the way they lived. They are the memories they created. They are the impact they left behind. And that was the message Dilron's family continued to share. They wanted the world to understand that before July 4, 2016, there was a man with hopes, responsibilities, and people who loved him. There was a father who mattered to his children. There was a partner who mattered to his family. There was a person whose absence would change many lives. The tragedy of sudden loss is that the future disappears instantly. When someone dies after a long illness, families often have time to prepare emotionally. They have conversations. They say goodbye. They make peace with what is coming. But when someone dies unexpectedly, the mind struggles to accept reality. The person was here yesterday. They had plans. They had tomorrow. Then suddenly, they are gone. For Dilron Small's loved ones, the hardest moments were likely not only the day of the shooting. They were the days afterward. The quiet moments. The moments when life continued but felt completely different. A phone call that would never come. A conversation that would never happen. A family event where someone was missing. Grief is often found in ordinary places. A familiar song. A photograph. A place someone used to sit. A memory that appears without warning. These small reminders can bring back the reality that someone important is no longer there. For Dilron's son, the loss carried a different kind of sadness. He was only 5 months old when his father died. He would not have memories created through years of shared experiences. He would not remember conversations between father and son. He would not remember lessons learned together. Instead, he would grow up with stories. Stories told by people who knew his father. Photographs showing moments he was too young to remember. A connection built through the memories of others. This is one of the deepest tragedies of losing a parent early in life. It is not only the loss of the person. It is the loss of everything that person could have given in the future. The guidance. The protection. The encouragement. The relationship that would have developed over decades. A child does not only lose who their parent was. They lose who their parent could have become. The legacy of Dilron Small therefore became about more than remembering the past. It became about preserving his place in the lives of those who remained. His family continued to speak about him because silence can sometimes allow people to disappear from public memory. They wanted his name to represent a human life, not only a controversial case. They wanted people to see the father behind the headline. The person behind the argument. The life behind the tragedy. This desire for remembrance is common among families affected by violent deaths. When the public focuses on a single moment, families often feel that the entire life of their loved one is being reduced. A person becomes a photograph. A name becomes a debate. A life becomes a legal argument. But families know the truth is much larger. They know the jokes. They know the personality. They know the habits. They know the moments that strangers never saw. Those are the things that create a person's real legacy. Not a courtroom transcript. Not a news report. Not a single night. The memory of Dilron Small also became connected to the larger discussion about police accountability and community trust. His name joined many others involved in difficult conversations about law enforcement and the use of deadly force. For some people, his case represented the need for stronger accountability. They believed that when a civilian dies during an encounter with an armed officer, the circumstances must be examined carefully. They believed communities need confidence that justice applies equally. For others, the case represented the challenges faced by police officers. They believed officers must be able to protect themselves when they believe they are in danger. They feared that criminalizing split-second decisions could make policing more dangerous. These disagreements continued because the issues involved are deeply complex. There is a desire for safety. There is a desire for justice. There is a desire for accountability. And there is a desire to recognize the reality that officers sometimes face dangerous situations. The difficulty is finding a balance. A balance where communities feel protected. A balance where officers understand their authority comes with responsibility. A balance where human life remains at the center of every decision. The story of Delrawn Small continues to raise these questions because it represents something familiar to many people. A moment that began as ordinary. A disagreement that should have ended differently. A situation where emotions moved faster than understanding. The case reminds people that every interaction has consequences. A person's reaction in a moment of anger can affect multiple lives. A decision made in fear can create years of pain. And sometimes, there is no opportunity afterward to fix what happened. The later naming of Delrawn Small Way in Brooklyn became a symbolic act of remembrance. It represented an effort to ensure that his name remained connected to the community. A reminder that he was not only part of a tragedy. He was part of a neighborhood. He was part of a family. He was part of people's lives. A street sign cannot replace a person. It cannot bring back lost years. It cannot erase grief. But memorials serve an important purpose. They tell future generations that someone existed. Someone mattered. Someone was loved. The legacy of Delrawn Small is therefore not only found in the questions surrounding his death. It is also found in the people who continue to remember him. In the family members who speak his name. In the community that recognizes his story. In the conversations that his case continues to inspire. Because every controversial case eventually reaches a point where the legal arguments end. The verdict is delivered. The documents are filed. The courtroom becomes quiet. But the human story continues. And the human story of Delrawn Small is the story of a man whose life was far more than the final seconds captured on a surveillance camera. He was a father who should have had more time. A partner who should have shared more memories. A person whose future was taken away unexpectedly. The greatest tragedy is not only that Delrawn Small died. It is that he had so much life left to live. So many moments that never happened. So many memories that were never created. So many ordinary days that never arrived. And perhaps the most important lesson from his story is this. Behind every case is a person. Behind every headline is a family. And behind every statistic is a human life that once mattered to someone.